A Science of Change, podcasting by Gilmore Crosby, social scientist, author, and organization development professional since 1984. Okay, welcome to another podcast. And today I am blessed with the presence of Kurt Lewin's grandson, Michael Papanek. And so, Michael, we've spoken before, but I just really appreciate you being willing to participate in this podcast. And I'm just going to toss it to you in a moment, just for the viewers or the listeners to hear tales that you have that are unique, perhaps, about your grandfather, Kurt Lewin. And really, we can just go anywhere you want to go with this.
Well, I'd certainly be curious what your listeners are curious about, but thank you, Gil. Yeah, we've known each other for many years. You're one of the few people out there who's really still doing Lewin as Lewin. You know, you literally talk about tea groups and conduct your certain manner of a tea group. You talk a lot about Lewin. You write a lot about Lewin. And it's always so, it just makes me feel good. It's very gratifying to know about all the people like yourself. I just participated in a brand new book about Lewin called The Kurt Lewin Unplugged, which is only in German, but there's the Lewin Center. There's so many different people that after so many years still are interested in him, and for various reasons, I think that he's still sort of attractive. The first and most important being it's still useful.
Yep.
As you prove every time somebody pays you to help them using some things that you may have learned from your dad or from Lewin. So anyway, I appreciate you for keeping it going and keeping it present and connecting all this with today's issues. In some ways, the more time goes by, the more these issues emerge and reemerge. And when you think about what's happening in the world, I know in some ways, we don't have big wars like World War II anymore where millions of people die, but we
knock on wood.
Knock on wood, not for now. That's right. So, but a world of conflict, a world where there are challenges with what Lewin called majority-minority relationships, a world where there's change, a world where, the ability to see the group and team dynamic in a way which allows you to do something about that. If anything, it's more valuable than it ever was in some ways. And Lewin also, his story, his life is about being Jewish. And again, many of the issues that Jews and others care about are not the same as they would be following World War II, but are still quite life and death. And when Lewin was working, he had great humor, which passed along in my family, even though so much tragedy affected him and his family. But it was also life and death, the issues he was working on.
Yep.
So these were not, I don't say academic in a bad way, yay for academic, of course. But, his nickname is the practical theorist. If there's anything, it's sort of almost, there might even be an emphasis on the practical. He was one of the first people at his time, along with others at the same time, who said, the people we work with are not the subjects of our experiment. They're the client. And they should be treated like a client who wants to improve something.
Yep, they can do their own experiments.
And what matters is not the interesting theory so much as the practical application to a real life issue that'll change somebody's state. And so I think that's, as I say, people are still attracted to him. I think the practical nature, his ability to deal with things that most people couldn't even deal with, let alone draw graphically or some of the other creative things he did. He was a heretic, and I'm proud to be the offspring of a heretic. I like to think of myself as a bit of a heretic. Call it innovation if you don't like the word heretic. but it's a dramatic challenging of the status quo. And he did this as a member of an oppressed minority. So it was hard enough to go against the grain, but to do so as a Jewish person was especially difficult, including in the United States, where he encountered lots of anti-Semitism. So
he had a hard time getting here because of that.
That's for sure. Yep, which are a lot of the stories in my family. I didn't know who he was as a young boy. He was just my mom's father who had died when my mom was young, and he would be talked about. And it wasn't until much, much later that I had any clue who he was, let alone how prominent he was in a field that I ended up going into. Yeah.
Well, it's a beautiful thing that you went into it. And by the way, I appreciate I'm honored by your appreciation of my own
sure.
enthusiasm about your grandfather's.
Yeah, and there are so many people that are still so enthusiastic. I think there's two main reasons for this. One is because of the practical impact of whether you're trying to lead a change or a million things you're trying to do. There's very practical tools. I can literally use the tool in the very next meeting I'm in, or the next memo I write, or whatever it might be, the next decision I make. I think the other main thing that makes him so attractive is he's still very attractive to oppressed minorities. And a lot of the people that are in the Lewin Center or the various other organizations, especially in the United States, was it his 75th birthday this year? I can't remember. And I was invited to a whole bunch of really interesting events. And at a lot of the events, they might just have people, it was a fair number of people, take a little while, but they would just talk about, why are you here? And why do you care about this guy who passed away so many years ago and so forth? And I noticed that way out of proportion to the population was the number of people of color or other minority members at that meeting. And they would talk about his impact on them as a member of, again, using Lewin's old language, an oppressed minority.
Mm-hmm.
And the same questions that the Jew would have to think about, or any oppressed person might think about, are similar questions we have now. For example, one of his questions, which he wrote about extensively, and I know you're quite familiar with this one as your own work on diversity now, you're still drawing, I understand, from some of that. Anyway, he would talk about how, should I try to win over the oppressor?
Mm-hmm.
Hey, German person, I'm a Jew and I served in the war and I fought for the Kaiser and I'm a good Jew. I'm a good German and you should know me as a good German. And if I sort of quote unquote come out to you, maybe over time you go, well, you know what? I know that fella Kurt. He's not so bad. Maybe the Jews aren't so bad. So that's one oversimplified approach, which is bridge building.
Mm-hmm.
And Lewin was very into bridges, literally, figuratively, metaphorically. So how do we bridge that? But then he has another letter when he says, if they're trying to kill me, maybe that's not the move.
Right.
And so when you think of a gay person, should that gay person risk, maybe not as much in the U.S. as it once was, but certainly parts of the world, being gay risks your life. Some of this stuff that's happening in Africa is just shockingly terrible. And so, but it's true here. And it was especially true, I think, maybe 10, 15 years ago, Harvey Milk and so much of the protests then. And they were like, should I tell the truth about who I am? Because, my dad doesn't know that I'm gay and he doesn't know that his own son is a gay person. And maybe if he did, he'd start to say, well, I love my son. So I've got something I've got to reconcile here.
Yep, it's still true here.
And yeah, it's still true in the U.S., especially depending on, the sort of the culture, the microculture of California versus somewhere else. By the way, I have good faith in most human beings, but unfortunately we have plenty that are not good actors there. And so just the idea that he's sort of current in helping people with those issues, I think, is sort of the second reason why people care so much about him. So the first is those things like action learning or the 3-phase change model, which, by the way, he never described in the exact way that most people describe it now, but he came close. so you have this idea of, the people that are going to solve the problem or to figure out the problem, its solution, the action plan. That way we'll get execution, we'll get implementation. We'll be on the right side of that 75% of changes fail to achieve their intended outcome, right? So these are all incredibly useful, and they're frameworks, which is something that I think most people in our field use frameworks, but I'm especially a framework guy. I'm not getting along with this other VP. Well, there's probably a framework we can use to help you both assess what's happening as well as come up with an action plan.
Yeah, my whole most recent book is about a framework for thinking about diversity. And
yes, that's right. Yeah. I noticed that's right. And so practical, if I can say practical theories, or a slightly more modern word might be practical frameworks or practical models. And again, they allow us to see the same situation with new eyes, which these new eyes allow us to then see new root causes. The new root causes can help. We can see forces, like a force field analysis. And the root cause, being able to see all this then leads to strategies and actions. And so many leaders that we work with, you and me and others, they're kind of sitting there in a current state, and often they have a vision of a future state, and they literally don't know the first step to bridge the gap between the two and create the new reality. And so a lot of times what we do that using things like Lewin's work. We know the first step, the second step, not by rote, everything's tailored and different and unique, but there are also some ways to use these frameworks and say, for example, we might say, well, the first thing you need to know is, do other people agree with your motivation to change? Do they have any motivation to change? Right? It's not always the very first thing to do, but it's one of those early things that we're probably going to need to do so that we're not trying to coerce people into something, which is possible, but it's like the hardest way. A lot of these leaders how do I change people's minds? Oh boy, you want to change minds? Well, that might be the right thing, but that's the hardest thing. Better yet, understand the current mind, how it relates to what you're trying to do. So it's possible to change minds and to change motivations, but usually you're wiser to align motivations to implement a complex stakeholder type of change. So that's just one example. I'm sitting here, whatever. Even a simple change. I'm going from a geographic sales orientation in my organization to a product and client orientation. A typical change that happens all the time. Well, these tend to be disasters. Sales go down. Everybody's upset. Oh, I spent years building a relationship with the people in St. Louis. Now what happens? I don't have St. Louis anymore. How am I going to make money, et cetera, et cetera? Why are we doing this? And so that's a very kind of Lewinian situation. And we can go all the way to some of his case studies, the work he did on the factory floor. And it's very, if you took kind of time identifiers off of it, a lot of people would read this and go, oh, this might not have been written in 2024, but it's certainly, 20th century, 21st century, because of human nature. And
hasn't changed.
That's right. And
human nature.
Yeah, we call it a team. He called it a group. I'll give you a very quick story. When he first got to the U.S., he was talking with various students, and he said he was interested in goops. He spoke no English when he got to the U.S., which is insane. I mean,
it's amazing how quickly.
Crazy. But, he made up for it with good humor, relationships, and the ability to listen, even when he didn't speak the language. But anyway, he had a bunch of students say, "What are goops?" And he meant groups.
Goops.
My mother, Dr. Miriam Lewin, would tell that story.
That's a good story.
Yeah.
Hey, I just want to say, when I said earlier that the clients can do their own experimentation, that's at least one of the things that I've gotten out of Lewinian theory. Like if there's a big change, is to get the people who are actually facing the problem to come up with their own solutions and to attempt, to experiment, basically. And so that's, in my mind, that's a big piece of Lewin's wisdom
It's
for me.
deeply, no, Jill, it's deeply foundational. There's so much in what you just brought up. Okay. And I will go to what to me is sort of the deepest foundational level, which is a respect for human beings. It's a Jewish tradition, the way that we value life.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it's just a human tradition. I certainly think most religions probably value life in a very similar way and care about the essential power of anyone. And I'll use the term lowest, quote unquote, lowest on the totem pole. This essential, in other words, again, they're the client, not the subject. I'm not the grand master. I'm not the brilliant scientist manipulating these little ants on an anthill. The ants are the boss. The ants are in charge. The ants are running the thing, well or poorly, but that's what it is. And so the idea that says we should ask. I was doing a leadership workshop in many years ago now in Hong Kong, and we had quite an interesting mix of people in the room. We had native-born mainland Chinese, Hong Kong Chinese, American and British expats, and I'm in there kind of doing what one might call a bit of a Western, be a collaborative leader, be a facilitative leader. And I'll never forget one of the people saying, if I asked my staff what to do, they'd all quit out of terror. And that the employees are my children. I am their father. Mm-hmm. And by the way, he meant that in the most positive, like a father would die for their children. A father cares and is responsible. Very heavy responsibility. This is a guy who wasn't saying sort of, but they were children in the sense that they certainly couldn't make decisions. And it was this whole model of leadership. And it's interesting, if everybody buys that model, including the employees, and they are as benevolent, right? So you remember Lewin's original leadership style, his probably most famous work in terms of that experiment of autocratic, laissez-faire, democratic.
Yep.
We would use different models and words now. Instead of autocratic, we might say command and control. Instead of laissez-faire, we might say hands off. And instead of democratic, we might say facilitative or collaborative. But, one of the things that I remember Lewin and his partner saying is, well, we're a little disappointed that, the autocratic does seem to be the most productive. So it depends on how you measure results and productivity.
Yeah, at least when the boss was right there when the leader was right there, watching everyone, it was productive.
Yes, authoritative with great care. You can't combine authoritative with laissez-faire, where they almost don't pay attention, just swoop in and make bad decisions that screw everybody up or something, right? So that's absolutely right. That's sort of even a word. And people's aren't simply one style, right? We all
sure.
There are times when I might be what someone else calls autocratic. I probably wouldn't believe I'm being autocratic. So, the idea still, well, what is your theory of leadership? I'm literally later today giving a leadership assessment to a coaching client, where I talk about stakeholders and stuff. And he has a belief, at least we think he has a belief based on his, reverse engineering his beliefs from his behavior. But I also have spoken to him about this. He hasn't got the assessment yet, but I'm still having coaching meetings already. Leaders supposed to have pretty much all the answers and be right all the time. And that if you don't have all the answers, you're not right all the time, then you won't move up in your career. And you're not being a proper leader. And so as we know, results are driven by behavior. Behavior is driven by thinking. So we have to work on the thinking level with people. And that's the other thing that Lewin did is he went from the general to the exemplified, right? Or from the example to the general really well. So we could say, okay, here's a general statement from Lewin, involve the people in the change that going to have to implement the change. Very, very simple statement. That's a general statement. But then you can go very specifically, well, how do we do problem solving? Force field analysis will help you with this. Root cause problem solving, all the other things, unfreezing, reforming, refreezing, change begins with an ending. All those kind of Lewinian things can then be applied to the very next meeting, or the change that's not going fast enough, or the resistance you don't understand, or the buy-in you're not getting from some key group.
Yep.
So it's pretty powerful in that regard still.
And you have to adapt. When I've worked with Eastern cultures, let's say, I've found that people still want to influence, but they want to influence without what seems as like disrespect for the leader. So letting them influence anonymously has, in my experience at least, they really appreciate it if their ideas can somehow be
interesting. Yeah, they do it. Because again, those cultures, which I'm not an expert at, my belief is, well, they work out their conflicts somehow.
Yep.
I'll talk about Canada, right? That this idea of Canada nice. Us Americans, we think Canadians, they seem so nice. Well, I love Canadians, of course. They will stab you in the back while they're shaking your hand. Okay, they have conflict, they have difficulty. Sometimes quite serious. I do a lot of work in Australia now for reasons I won't get into, but I'm appreciated down there, which is fun.
Cool.
And again, the culture of how do we confront? Who is the boss? How do you speak or not speak to the boss? Is all based on these various kind of ideas. And I'm agnostic except to results.
Sure.
And how people feel is a result. So we have what I like to call doing goals, but we also need to have being goals. How do we want to be? God forbid, let's not use the Mack truck theory. You get hit by a Mack truck. Let's use the lottery winner theory. If you leave tomorrow, how will your experience have been? When we talk about branding, we talk about the new consumer. The new consumer is very into being. So the new consumer has a job they want to do. If it's a cleaning product, they want to clean the bathroom. But they need a feeling about how they're cleaning the bathroom. They want to feed their family, but they want to feel a certain way about feeding their family. They want a car, but they want to feel a certain way about using that car. And so, again, this puts even more onto the table the idea that when we really get it all in focus, like when you go to the eye doctor and that last lens clicks in, Lewin is going to tell you, you're going to click it all in. You're going to have the problem, you're going to have the solution, you're going to have the ownership, the buy-in, you're going to have respect.
Yeah, really
you're going to
important.
be able to build some trust. You're going to have a place that's safe. You're going to be a happy warrior with a sense of humor, even in the toughest times.
Well, Lewin certainly was that.
Yep. No, when you think about what happened in my family, both the Papanek side as well as the Lewin side, we paid a price. So, there was a lot of serious issues. Gertrude Lewin had serious depression, losing her husband in a terrible way. My mom's brother committed suicide. So when you think about Gertrude Lewin losing her husband, losing his son, pretty horrible situation.
Your great-grandmother died in a concentration camp.
I'm sorry, say again. I couldn't hear it.
Lewin's mother, your great-grandmother,
right.
She passed away in a concentration camp.
That's right.
She was murdered.
She was, yeah. Jews tend to say murdered. Non-Jews tend to say killed. Somebody was killed in a concentration. I always say murdered. Because I think it's more accurate. I think that what's happening today in the Middle East, these are murders.
Sure.
Not sort of killings like an accident or a volcano blew up or something. A pet peeve of mine, war doesn't break out. The headline should always say, war started by whoever started it. And it can be both sides that started something, but it doesn't break out like a virus or like a high tide or a flood or something. This is a choice that we make. But yeah, and I'm sure you know this story. I don't know if your listeners will be, but So Lewin left pretty early. Lewin and his family left on a relative basis pretty early. The actions against Jews were quite developed by then.
Mm-hmm.
And it was the announcement that a Jewish professor could never be a full professor and could only be what was called a docent in German. That was just another blow. Lewin was just returning from travels to both America and Asia when he saw that. And that's when he started to think, okay, we probably have to get out of here. At great risk to himself, he went back because his mother and his aunt, his mother's sister, were still there. And I mentioned this idea of being a good German at the same time that you're trying to be Jewish. And this was incredibly difficult, including, again, I think you may have quoted, during the war, he would go and fight side by side, with these non-Germans, non-Jews, and then back at the camp, he would hear what he called, I believe I'm quoting, the most crass anti-Semitic comments, just wildly anti-Semitic comments. He's like, wow, I can go out there and save lives and risk my own life. And his brother died fighting for the Kaiser. So when Lewin went back and said, Mom, you got to get out of here, originally she said, they're not going to go after me. First of all, I'm an old lady.
Mm-hmm.
So they're not going to care about me. And second of all, this is a Gold Star family. You all served, and one of you died in World War I, so they would never come after me. Finally, she saw what was happening. Her and her sister escaped to Holland. And, Chris, that's where they were captured, was in Holland. And shipped. My mom used to know where they went. And
Lewin had sent money and tried various means. And you just called me Chris, which a lot of people do. That's my
Gil.
I love it.
Sorry, I mean Gil.
Anyway.
Gil. It's C. Gilmore on the little screen we're looking at here. So that meant, wait, his name is Gil, isn't it?
Yeah,
anyway, my apologies for that.
No worries. Hey, speaking of your then the family history, you've told me before about like sitting around the table, the kitchen, the dining room table, perhaps with your grandmother, who was quite an intelligent woman herself, right? I mean, she PhD,
she was a social worker, and she trained other social workers, and she helped almost all the books published after his death.
Like I've got Resolving Social Conflicts here and Field Theory and Social Science, which she edited for.
Two of my favorite works, by the way.
Yeah, they're great stuff. But she edited all that. But any stories you can tell of like what that was like being in that family setting with?
Well, again, most of the stories, especially while Gertrude was still alive, was family stories. Not Lewin as professor, not Lewin as psychologist or Gestalt expert or whatever. Certainly heard the theory of his death, the story of when he died. He was having trouble that night and went to the hospital, and the doctor said, "You're overreacting. You're fine. Go home." And he died a number of hours after that. So there's always been a question. Would he have survived if the doctor had originally checked him into the hospital and tried to treat him?
Mm-hmm.
So that's kind of another interesting little story. And then I finally got to see some of his quite famous films.
Mm-hmm.
Using film the way he did was a little bit like using AI or something today. Film was brand new. Most people didn't understand it. It was a fancy new technology. And it was all part of his adaptability and interest in what's new and what's interesting and what can we try. And so the field theory videos, show, for example, often with children, right?
Mm-hmm.
So he liked to work with children. He said they're so obvious. If they're unhappy, they're probably crying. Whereas if you act an adult, if they're unhappy, they might lie.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
So kids are happy or sad or whatever very easily. So, and they're sort of very observable. It's a little more pure, if you will, in some ways. He also, of course, did a lot of work with adults, obviously.
Right.
And so some of these videos are, he'll put the toy the child wants on the inside of a fence, a small circular, a foot wide or 2 feet wide. And then the toddler would display certain behaviors, which he would then think about for a field theory and balances and a force field and barriers and all the things that he would use then to describe freedom of movement and all the things that he was describing in dynamics. So when I saw this, my mom would say, "Okay, that's your great cousin." And here's who they were, and so here's how this was, Lewin's sister, blah, blah, blah. This is his niece or nephew. By the way, some people who didn't like Jews used this quote unquote experimenting on children, which was 1,000% bullshit. But it's actually cited in a correspondence between the people at Harvard and the people at Yale,
yes,
who both refused to allow Lewin in. And you had to have a job before you could come.
Preeminent psychologists wrote stuff like that Lewin's children are like perfect little yids. That's or something like that.
That's the quote. I tend to. I wasn't going to use that because I really don't appreciate that term, but yeah, that's
these were the people in charge of the universities.
Yep.
Oh my God.
Yep. And so that whole world was just so different. I mean, and this kept going at Harvard. My father went to Harvard Medical School. And at the time, it was a pretty small class. Don't quote me on any of the numbers. And I believe 4 Jews were allowed in that year.
Mm-hmm.
And my dad explained to me, well, they have a quota. And, and a lot of people these days will say how hard, quotas are terrible, quotas are unfair, or whatever. And most of us certainly think there's a quota as a limit, no more than 4. But I'll never forget my father saying to me, the quota used to be 0. So the fact that they now say we'll take 4 Jews is a huge improvement. So it's kind of funny the way you think about it.
And actually, one of Lewin's action research projects, according to his Marrow, the autobiographer, was that he sued the university. Right. It was Columbia, I think. Columbia.
I forgot about that. Yep.
Yeah, and that started a ripple effect across the United States about those quotas.
That's right. And he was obviously a limiting quota, but my dad kind of, the quota used to be no Jews, or no blacks, no whatever, no female,
right,
no women,
no
etc.
women.
So to him, this is a bit of a improvement.
It's just amazing to me that Lewin had so many women students in Berlin. That he just had actively engaging with him in group discussions and coffee shops, and in a university where, as far as I understand it, he wasn't even allowed to talk to the professors. Like you just don't talk to the professors.
That was why, I don't remember that as well actually as you do.
And so here he was teaching and just engaging people and letting them, combat his own theories to the best of their ability and so on.
Well, and again, this was his incredible, democracy is not voting, right? And so again, when I talked about that foundational belief in people, that's in democracy as well. And he believed a couple of important things that I think. One, every generation needs to learn democracy over.
Mm-hmm.
I think we're experiencing a lot of the problems with that right now here in the United States. That this generation, I raise my hand. I'm the generation at fault. My generation needed to do a much better job teaching democracy. I think, demonstrating. But
one thing he pointed out that's related to that is, and when he was writing about post-World War II Germany, is that the way people are taught in the school system either teaches you how to think for yourself and think out loud and be an active citizen, or it teaches you to learn the right answers according to the authority figures. And so the school systems teach people to be prone to autocracy.
Yeah, and he talked. That's exactly the story I was heading for.
I'm
Also,
sorry.
and no, that's wonderful, and I'll just augment it by the fact that he was in the United States on one of his earlier visits before escaping here. Let's say permanently, and he was able to visit schools as you would think he would. Again, we haven't even talked about all his ideas about education and learning, which
Hmm.
are
Hmm.
were quite dramatic for the time. Again, Herr Professor with all the answers was not what he was after. And so he was in the school and he watched the student and a teacher, and the teacher would ask the student questions. And that was just mind blowing to him. And that was not the style in Germany. And again,
Hmm.
it taught you, as you say, I'm not quoting Lewin here. I believe I'm quoting Orwell, who says the first and most important requirement of the authoritarian regime is you suspend your own beliefs about truth, that
Hmm.
you accept, that's the first and most important thing is just to accept their version of things. And you really only have one decision to make, as you said, Gil, which is do I follow or not?
Hmm.
And that's it. And it's a
Yep.
little bit like the Chinese, person I spoke about before, who kind of says, "Well, I'm their father, and yeah, I'll punish them when they need punishing, but I'll care for them." And so this idea of questioning, and when we talk about his style of leadership, right? So we talk about Bethel, Maine, and NTL, and sort of what I like to tell the story of the invention of feedback. I don't know if that's technically possible that anyone could invent feedback, but essentially, as you know, he was recording the T groups, on this huge reel-to-reel recording thing, and him and his students running the T groups would listen to the tapes at night. And the
Hmm.
understanding I have, this was sort of a residential thing where you'd spend the week or whatever, and the number of the participants in the T groups are walking by the cabin or wherever they were, and they hear themselves. And they come and knock on the door and say, "Can we listen too?" And that's the moment where most other professors would have said, "Oh, of course, I don't want you listening to yourself. You're the subject. You'll screw up. This will screw up our data, or whatever. This will mess with our experiment." He said, "No, of course. Come on in." And at one point, listening to the tape, one of the participants said to the other, "You see, you're not listening to me right there. You're not hearing what I was saying. You're right. Now that I'm listening to the recording, I wasn't getting what you were saying." And that was kind of that first idea that we can think about how we think. We can talk about how we talk. We can go meta with our feedback and start to influence our own dynamic.
Yep. The birth
Um,
of the T group.
and it's the birth of the T group. And again, I like to say sort of the birth of the modern idea of feedback,
Hmm. Hmm.
which is
Which Lewin even asked for from the participants, then to the
yeah,
faculty.
which is crazy. What the hell are you asking them? Most people would say. I remember at B school we had was it Warren Bennis? I'm having a senior moment here. The big quality guy from the 70s and 80s.
Deming?
Deming, thank you so much. Not Bennis, that's an investor. I mean Deming. And Damon gave a talk at U of M, which was great. And I remember hearing the U of M people had spoken to him and said, "Now we have a little evaluation sheet. We're going to provide a little survey to everybody who took your, because of quality. And, obviously, Deming, you support this idea of measuring quality." He said, "Absolutely not. If you send that out, I won't come." And they're like, "Well, what are you talking about?" He says, "You can ask them 2 years later. Ask them after they graduate and they're in business if my talk was helpful. Otherwise, no." So yeah, so it's interesting this idea of, well, how do I and when do I, do this? And he said, "Well, that's superficial. The student doesn't know how good my talk is until they're out in the world."
Yeah, well, that makes sense. Well, look, so you need to go in what, 6 minutes?
That's correct.
Okay, and I've loved this. I could do this all night with you now that we've started, actually.
Yes.
But with the 6 minutes, like your book,
Mm.
You're willing to say a couple things about why people should be reading your book from breakdown to breakthrough?
Yes, and go ahead and give them the tagline there, unless you don't have the book in front of you. It's
Forging resilient business relationships in the heat of change.
right. So I spent, so many years, right, and doing what I do. And I've had clients ask me so many times, what should I read? Where's a book that has all, quote, this stuff, close quote, in it? And, it was very tough because I always, I tend to like, one or two chapters of other people's books. And I was careful. I sort of don't want to recommend something. They're going to read the whole book. Maybe I got to introduce stuff. So I didn't always have a great recommendation. I had a few. And so that was one reason why I finally wrote the book, was to try to get things into a format that people can use. And forging resilient relationships in the heat of change, or business relationships. So the idea that I kind of brought is this idea of heat and a heat curve. And so when I describe relational dynamics, whether that's 2 people or 20 people or 200 people, or 2,000 or 2 million, they have what we would call a heat curve. So if you think of, we're on audio here, I can't show the visual, but the x-axis would be, quote, heat. This is intensity, controversy. It doesn't have to be conflict. It could be excitement or very positive in an interaction. We're all in a meeting. We're at the edge of our seat. Thank God we're finally talking about something X, whatever it is.
Okay.
So that's heat. Now, the curve goes up in the beginning. So the more heat we bring, so the y-axis is breakdown or breakthrough. So as heat increases, we go up the curve, meaning more ability for breakthrough. The teams that can discuss their relationships, their team dynamic the most effectively will change it the most effectively.
Okay.
And executive teams, leadership teams, all teams need this ability to see, therefore discuss, therefore change their dynamic. And so that's a lot of what the book is about, tools and frameworks for understanding this heat curve and essentially shifting it. So people understand this, right? If you ever have ground rules in your meetings or your workshop, maybe you have a ground rule at a workshop, listen before responding, or be tough on the problem and easy on the people, or one speaker at a time. These are all attempts to move that heat curve up and to the right. And so if you're in a culture, you may notice, boy, we have a bad heat curve, meaning we go into breakdown very quickly. So
like we avoid, we just fight.
That's right. We avoid the controversial issue. We just don't discuss it. Somebody says something, let's take that offline. Somebody says something, well, I don't feel good right now about what you're saying. It's okay to say these things necessarily, but if they stop the discussion, if they cut off the curve. So a lot of leaders say, oh, I'm losing control, quote unquote. They're really just going up the heat curve, and it's intense for you. That's all. It's tough for them. So I use the heat curve and a number of other ways that allow you to assess your relationships. So first of all, you have to decide, well, which are my most important relationships? So where should I focus? What's going to be key? Then there are tools, and the book is full of worksheets and job aids and so forth. Then there are tools for assessing those relationships. How resilient are those relationships? A resilient relationship I qualify as being strong, flexible, and fair. Strong, it produces results. Flexible, it can produce results under changing conditions. And fairness is an important part of human resilience. Something that's unfair is unsustainable for most people. So an engineer for resilience just needs strong and flexible, like a bridge or a palm tree. Humans need this third aspect of fairness in their relationships. And so the book is based on interviews with mostly Silicon Valley leaders who were very generous. I use their name and their company, and I quote them and so forth.
You're in the Bay Area?
Mostly in the Bay Area. I think I have a couple people. I have an insurance exec out of New York, but they're mostly Silicon Valley people. That's right. Companies like Yahoo or Cisco or Google, and they're little case studies and they're little examples. So again, I'm providing those frameworks. I'm running them through real life examples. Then I'm giving you job aids, other tools and frameworks so you can implement it.
Cool.
And so if somebody was going to think about, if you're one of those people that has high technical qualifications, whatever your business is. Doesn't have to literally be like computers or something. But if you have a lot of, you're an expert on real estate investing or whatever your company does, but you don't seem to have the relationship skills, what some people call the soft skills, the
Mm-hmm.
other half of the coin, if you will, the leader that has both is awesome. And I would
Yep.
say still quite rare in every organization. So the book is to help support people to add that human interaction to mature them and allow them to see and create strategies so their relationships are sustained when others might break down. So
Nice.
you want a resilient relationship with your clients, right? So when the budget gets cut, they kick everybody else out, but not you, right? So that's the idea. I try to and yeah, there's a lot of Lewin in that book, and I'm pleased to,
Cool.
to borrow from Lewin. I organized the entire book sort of around some of his frameworks.
Nice. You get his social psychology, I think, even better than I do around interpersonal relations and so on. So, well, look, Michael, we've hit your deadline. I know you have something else you have to go to right away.
Oh yeah,
So,
right on the hour here, or the
yeah, yeah. So I really
This was
appreciate
a
this.
pleasure.
You certainly carry the spirit of your grandfather, and which is a gift to all of us. And I think that's a wrap. So thank you very much.
Well, this was very enjoyable, sir. Thanks for asking me.
Cool. We'll have to do it again someday.
Okay.
Okay. You take care. Have a great rest of your day.
All right. Thank you, sir. See you soon.
Okay. Bye.
Bye-bye.
Hey, I appreciate you listening. This, again, is Gil Crosby. And I want you to take advantage of what's available to you. I have many free materials. I am happy to talk to people about their situations, especially if you're trying to create change, either social change or organization change. We have frequent workshops that are available, T group workshops. If you have never been in a T group with us, then don't miss it in your life. It's many people have said to me, of all the trainings I've ever received, I got this one 30 years ago, and it's the only one that stuck with me. You're learning from your actual interactions with the other participants and with the faculty. The faculty are walking the same talk that they're teaching of behavioral skills. It's a training workshop. That's what the T stands for. This is done in the spirit of the creation of T groups by Kurt Lewin and his associates. It's for groups. It's for teams. That's how it was originally designed. It is a opportunity to learn about theory and put it directly into practice. Again, the original design, you learn things and then you put them into practice. It was not just all ambiguity, which is how some T groups, most are led today, where the faculty hardly says anything. That's not how this is designed. So join us for that. There's always workshops. There's the Leadership Institute of Seattle, which has certificate programs, a two-year program where you will learn from T groups and learn how to do all the organization development work that my father designed, most of it, and I continue that practice alongside my brother Chris and many other associates. So don't be a stranger. There's a lot going on. It's always changing. So be in touch, and it's on the website, crosbyod.com. I look forward to working with you in your organization or as you pursue things like reducing gun violence and decreasing racism in our society. Whatever your goals are, the social science of Kurt Lewin guides how to achieve those goals in a reliable way. And so that's what I apply and practice every day and invite you to.